Hello, everyone. Welcome into another episode of Bowl Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. My name is Alex, as always, and we are here today to talk about the 53-man roster, sort of outline prediction, if you want to call it that. Chargers are back at rookie minicamp today. Draft stuff is all done, over. So I felt that this would be a good time to kind of talk about where some of the position battles, if you will, on the roster stand. Where do we kind of stand going into rookie minicamp, which again started today. And so you might see a couple cuts down to 90 in the next couple of days per Jim Harbaugh. So the roster movement is already started, even though it's only May. We're still a long ways out from training camp. Hence why I hesitate to call this like prediction, but more just outlining each position. I've made a slide to talk about basically all 11 positions plus the specialists. And so we'll talk about where some of those roster battles exist and where I sort of see the Chargers roster following the 2025 NFL draft. So without any further ado, let's get into it. And I will also talk about some of the stuff that Harbaugh ended up saying today at his mini camp press conference. But without any further ado, let's get into it. The Chargers early 53-man roster. It is indeed May, so it is jumping the shark. Again, mean this to be more of an outline than an outright prediction, but let's talk about it. 3 quarterbacks. I do have the Chargers keeping all 3 between Justin Herbert, Taylor Heinicke, and Easton Stick. Oh, God. Wow, I went 2 minutes without a fuck up. Great. Justin Herbert, Taylor Heinicke, and Trey Lance. And then DJ Uiagalelei, the quarterback formerly from Clemson, Oregon State, I believe he was at, and Florida State is also competing, I guess, for a spot, or more likely a potential practice squad spot here. So what do we make of this? I think there is some confusion on social media, at least that I've seen, about how the 3 QB rule works ever since it was instituted post the 49ers in the NFC Championship game. The 3rd quarterback does count against the 53-man roster when it is made and when it goes week to week. The 3rd quarterback, in the emergency role, does not count against the game day roster, the active 48-man roster. So that means you can bring up an extra guy from the practice squad. You can have another guy active instead of that 3rd quarterback. However, I don't think that really will change much about how the Chargers operate. For most of last year, while this rule was in effect, they essentially decided to go with Herbert, Heinicke, and then Easton Stick last year, following the trade for Taylor Heinicke, and they never cut Stick at any point. You look at Trey Lance's guarantees, I think he has about $1 million or so fully guaranteed, plus incentives and stuff that can, get him up to $2 million, and then after that, $6.5 million. And if that happens and he's actually playing games, something obviously went horribly wrong. But this is the group. I think Trey Lance will get some of that. Maybe you can develop him and have a couple great preseason games with him and flip him for something else, right? You could potentially do that. I don't think he really challenges Heinicke for QB2. There's an outside shot of it. Never say never. And the interesting note here was for DJ Uiagalelei, where I think some of the beat reporters, when he first signed as an undrafted free agent, essentially came out and said that he could convert to tight end or, have some type of position conversion. For what it's worth, the Chargers do still list him at quarterback. Jim Harbaugh was not explicitly asked about him today, but I thought that was an interesting note nonetheless. A lot of the information guys around the league have pegged him as a potential, positional conversion candidate. We'll see how that develops, but I think these are the 3 guys that make the roster. You can technically go back to, I guess, when Duggan was on the roster, and they did cut Duggan off the 53 and have him on the practice squad and just had Herbert and Stick back in the Tom Telesco era. But to me, when you sign Trey Lance to the contract you do, that does ultimately mean, to me, you're keeping 3 quarterbacks. But that could change. It's not a ton of guarantees necessarily, but I do think they are more into Trey Lance as an asset than that previous regime was to, say, taking a flyer on Max Duggan. But those are your quarterbacks, in my opinion. Running backs, I have Najee Harris, Omarion Hampton, first-round pick, Kimani Vidal, and Hassan Haskins. So I do have 4 of them. This is where you get into your first real contention point on the roster, and it could go either way, training camp competition sort of way. Najee and Omarion, nothing to talk about there. Those are your locks for guys that will be on the roster. After that, it gets interesting, right? Kimani Vidal obviously had some moments last year, but did struggle in the pass protection phase of the game. Hence why he was inactive for the last couple games, and they did pick up Hassan Haskins. They picked him up on waivers earlier in the year, but started getting him some more burn as a result. J.K. Dobbins has departed. They do have the UFA tender on J.K. Dobbins. I don't think anything is really coming of that from the Chargers end, and I do think Dobbins will probably end up signing with the team prior to like any of the contract things from that becoming a thing with the Chargers. So I do still think we'll probably see Dobbins somewhere else in another team's training camp with how the Chargers have constructed this running back room. The real debate here is Vidal versus Sanders. I do think that is the most interesting debate on the roster, and I don't necessarily take this to mean a ton, but when Jim Harbaugh is sitting at the podium and he's asked about some of the UDFA gems, he's asked about some of the guys, the first name out of his mouth was Raheem Sanders. He also mentioned Luke Grimm, who we'll get to in a bit, as well as Iowa State tight end Steve Klotz. But when the first name out of his mouth was Sanders, I was like, okay, that's interesting. Jarrett Patterson also kind of in the mix here as a guy who was on the practice squad last year, and I think got elevated once or twice. I don't remember. But he's obviously been a guy that's been in the system as well. So I really do think this comes down to a debate of Vidal versus Sanders, and that will be one of the big battles, if you want to say, going forward here in training camp and going forward into the preseason. And they'll get a bunch of preseason games to let those guys duke it out, to make the 53-man roster. We'll see if they do end up keeping 4. I think they do value Haskins enough from the standpoint of what they ask him to do on special teams, what they ask him to do as a pass blocker. From the standpoint of Vidal and Sanders, I would say the things that they struggle with the most, from Kimani's perspective, recognizing pass blocking assignments, from Sanders' perspective, just not a very good blocker. I do think they kind of keep him, or at least if not on the roster, as a practice squad guy in that regard. But if Vidal takes another step forward as a pass blocker, or if Sanders does, then obviously that maybe makes the need to keep Haskins a little bit less. But I do still think they value him a lot in that blocking / special teams phase of the game for sure. And so, yeah, that really is kind of summarizing my thoughts. I do think this battle, as much as it will come down to the preseason tape, right? Who's playing better in the preseason? Who's moving better in the preseason? I do think special teams will be very, important, as well as blocking, in determining the winner of this battle too, right? Najee and Omarion are going to be like 80-90% of the rushing volume, of the pass catching volume. So unless one of them gets injured, right? So if you're kind of standing out on this roster, it really is in those extra phases of the game, not so much what you're doing down to down from a production standpoint in the preseason, but what you're doing with those continuous reps. So that is kind of how I think that battle will be decided. But I do have them keeping 4. We'll see about Haskins, and I ultimately do think it's kind of a Sanders or Vidal thing right now, as opposed to a Sanders and Vidal thing. But you never know. If they both kind of improve in that extra phase of the game, like I said, then maybe that makes Haskins a little bit more expendable than he currently is. Wide receivers. No surprises here, I don't think. Ladd McConkey, Trey Harris, Mike Williams, Quentin Johnston, Darius Davis, and Keandre Lambert-Smith. are my 6 to me that have the path to make the roster. I think those are the 6 locks. It is a question of, do they keep 6 or do they keep 7? Brendan Rice, Jalen Reagor, Jalen Johnson, Des Fitzpatrick, and UDFA Luke Grimm from Kansas, who, as I mentioned earlier, was one of the guys Harbaugh, kind of hyped up a little bit in his press conference today. I haven't watched that much of Grimm. I watched a little bit of him while I was also watching Devin Neal at Kansas, getting ready for the draft process. Good player. I think he's a nice little addition to this room as far as boosting the level of competition. I think Keandre Lambert-Smith, and particularly taking a second receiver in this draft, makes it pretty tough for one of these guys that's on the bubble or outside looking in to make it. Reagor is a guy who obviously makes special teams contributions, but I don't think you can't put him on the practice squad for that as well. Even though the coaching staff, does like his contributions there. Same thing goes for Brendan Rice. I don't really see a need to keep a 7th receiver there if we're talking about him. I think Luke Grimm could push his way on, but then if he does push his way on, how long would he be the 7th receiver for, right? So these are all questions to be answered, but I do think this is leaning towards keeping 6 receivers instead of the 7 they did last year. But even the 7 that they kept last year did not last particularly long as the season went on. So again, these rosters change a lot throughout the season, even after the creation of the initial 53-man squad. But for me, I envision 6 here, especially with the Keandre Lambert-Smith pick, possible 7th from a special teams value standpoint, if it were to be a guy like Rice, Reagor, or if Luke Grimm were to kind of steal that momentum from those 2 guys. But for the moment, I see 6. I also, by the way, made sure all these numbers added up to 53 because I posted something on Twitter earlier in this week and I was like, shit, they add up to 52. But it is the 53-man roster. So I made sure, I think, possibly, I checked 3 or 4 times that these numbers add up to 53. So if I can still do math, then they definitely did. Tight ends and fullbacks. Let's get into it. The 3 locks on this roster are Conklin, Dissly, Gadsden. Not much to talk about with those guys. Obviously, Tyler Conklin in free agency on the 1-year, $3 million deal he's on. Dissly in the 2nd year of his contract now. Primed to take a little bit of a blocker plus TE screen stuff role. He'll still be involved in the passing offense, but not to the extent that he was last year, bringing in Conklin and Gadsden to kind of take that role for him while he can sort of focus on being that true C-gap blocking tight end, that true second guy in the tight end room. So that will work out nicely, I believe, this year, assuming Conklin as well as Gadsden can stay healthy. And it's a bit of a healthier tight end room from a responsibility standpoint, where you don't just have, like last year, Dissly, who was so overextended doing everything. And unfortunately, in the results, it kind of showed up that way. With some of the drops and critical moments, it was just, not necessarily his fault, but just a guy that was so overextended and doing everything in the offense, more than he should have been asked to do, right? And that is kind of that situation. The interesting spot on this roster, I believe, is what they decide to do at fullback. You have Scott Matlock, who was obviously fullback / defensive tackle last year. And you also have Tucker Fisk, who can be kind of a fullback / tight end as well. Not so much in the fullback realm, but certainly that kind of a blocking tight end. Obviously played a little bit last year after he was picked up, I think, on waivers from the Falcons. Steve Klotz, who Harbaugh mentioned is one of sort of his guys he really liked on tape from this undrafted free agent class. Harbaugh also mentioned specifically about Klotz. He has experience at tight end, fullback, and special teams, and they envision him in those 3 roles from college in this, rookie mini camp / training camp, all this kind of stuff process. So I think he's going to be one of those guys, one of those undrafted free agents that, barring injury, is in this thing to potentially make the roster or one of those practice squad spots until the very end of the process. Jordan Pataya was the Australian rugby player that they got out of the International Player Pathway Program this year. I forget the exact details on the contract he signed, but essentially it's a year-to-year deal. I don't think Pitaya is really a contender to make the roster. If you look at how the Chargers kind of use CJ Okoye, all those guys, who, by the way, congrats on getting on the Ravens to CJ Okoye, by the way. But Pitaya, to me, sounds like a player that you stick on the practice squad using that international player pathway bonus of like a guy who can be an extra practice squad spot. I do see that sort of being his role this year. And then McCallum Castles, of course, was the UDFA tight end that they got back to later after they had interviewed him in the pre-draft process and stuff like that. Ended up signing with the team and, you know, was on the practice squad and signed to a futures contract. It does really feel like this is a battle between Matlock and Klotz to see who can make the roster. How much do they value Matlock being able to play both sides of the ball? The Travis Hunter of the Chargers, if you will. But the defensive tackle snaps, in all seriousness, like how much do they value being able to do both of those things versus Klotz, who's more likely a pure tight end / fullback. So that'll be an interesting thing to monitor as this thing goes on. I think Klotz has a chance. I do have Matlock pegged there right now, but in 2 months, if it is him who wins the job or Tucker Fisk making it as the roster and maybe they keep 5, things that wouldn't surprise me. I do think this is a deeper tight end room than they have had in a little bit with the additions of Conklin, as well as drafting Ronnie Gadsden in the 5th round. So we'll see how that goes. Offensive line, a lot of names to name. Left tackle, Rashawn Slater. Left guard, Zion Johnson, who will get reps at center. So we'll see who ends up playing center and who ends up playing guard. But for the moment, I have Zion plugged in at left guard until further notice. Center, a competition perhaps between Bradley Bozeman, Andre James. 2 of those 3 spots will go to those guys, as we've known for a couple months and have said ad nauseum. Mekhi Becton at right guard, Joe Alt at right tackle. So that is 6 spots, including Andre James, sort of in that competition tier of this roster. And then I have Trey Pipkins, Jamari Sallier, as well as Pitt 6th round pick, Taylor Branson, who is at guard. Pipkins, obviously, somebody that offers you tackle guard flexibility. Sallier, a little less so in terms of the flexibility compared to Pipkins, but could do it if he's asked. And then Branson is obviously played tackle in the past, but they sort of view him internally as strictly a guard. Others on this roster include Carson Barnhart, Savion Washington, McClellan, Bucky Williams, Josh Kaltenberger, Corey Stewart, Nash Jones. Jones, Kaltenberger, Stewart, and Washington are their undrafted free agents from this class. And then Barnhart, McClellan, Williams are all guys that were here, as previously last preseason, got put on futures deals, got put on the practice squad. McClellan was actually someone who was like kind of low-key competing to make that last roster spot before he got injured and ultimately placed on season-ending IR before I think they even came close to making the final roster. So he's a name to watch if he is healthy. But to be honest, I think these spots are pretty baked in, especially now that you are kind of putting Trey to the periphery of being like your swing guy, Jamari in a more clear role, and having drafted Branson, who sticks on the roster most likely. So I do have 9 offensive linemen. Nothing much to talk about there other than the obvious Zion, Bozeman, James competition, which we'll see where that takes us. I've not gotten around to the Andre James film. I know Steven is still waiting to. So we'll kind of let you guys know what we think of that when we get the chance to. But I do think this is Zion will probably determine where the other guys go if they feel like he can play center. I do think they are serious about giving him that chance. But if they feel like he's better at guard, that he's going to play guard again, right? They're still fully behind Zion from what Harbaugh has said, even though they turned out his 5th-year option. But for this year, he is a key, integral part of that line. What happens with Bradley Bozeman and Andre James, we will have to see. But I do think right now, if you made me bet from how they talk about Zion, how they talk about Bradley, and how they view Andre James, I do think Bozeman starts at center, and I do think Zion starts at left guard if the season started today, sort of way. Edge, I have 4: Khalil Mack, Tuli Tuipulotu, Bud Dupree, Kyle Kennard, who they drafted out of South Carolina in the 4th round. Others, Draymond Morris Brash, obviously was on the practice squad last year after a pretty decent preseason performance. Garmin Randolph, Caleb Murphy, and Kylan Guidry. Also on this list, they, as I was making this PowerPoint and looking over the depth chart, they actually just waived Chris Collins today, who was a practice squad futures guy who was on the team for a while. So that opened up a roster spot, I believe, although I think there's still like 3 over 90-man limit right now. But that aside, I think this is pretty simple to figure out. As far as the first 4 guys, this is a position where I'm interested to see if they add a 5th guy. I am not saying anything's imminent or something like that. But if they went after, somebody who can do some rotational edge stuff, I wouldn't be surprised if they just kind of got another, impact player who can eat some snaps, especially if you're going to sometimes want to play Tuli a little bit more on the interior and have him rush next to Mac on certain occasions. If you don't view him quite as the full-time edge opposite Mac that Joey was, you want to do some moving around with him. I wouldn't be shocked if they signed another edge at this point and then kept 5 going into the year. Obviously, a lot of free agents they can go after, including offensive linemen, Keenan Allen, which has been rumored for months. But edge is one that people don't talk about that I think could generate some conversation if they wanted to kind of bolster the depth there and get some more inning snap eaters, if you will. But as currently constructed, the 4 they're keeping are pretty straightforward, in my opinion. Defensive tackle. Taylor Tart, Otito Ogbonya, Jamari Caldwell, who they drafted in the 3rd round out of Oregon, Naquan Jones, Deshaun Hand, and Justin Eboigbe, who, per Jesse Minter, has put on 20 pounds. He apparently has had a very good offseason process, and I do think they expect him to play more than he did last year when he was I think he played 26 snaps. He was going in between training with the DTs, training with the edges a little bit based on what they needed in certain weeks. But I think the plan, based on how Jesse Minter has spoken, is him to get a lot more reps, him to get a lot more snaps, and be a lot more involved physically going forward this year based on what he's done this offseason and his work with Ben Herbert and stuff like that. Others, Tara Edwards, Josh Fuga from undrafted free agency, as well as Christopher Hinton, who is still on the roster, mainstay since like 2022 at this point. He's weirdly been with the Chargers now for like 3 years on the practice squad, future contracts, I think ever since that Miami game in 2022, if I'm not mistaken. So he's a guy that's kind of stuck on in that capacity and has been in that room for a while. Ironically, one of the vets in this room, considering everyone else around him is sort of new now that they have kind of fully rebooted the DT room relative to what it was in the past. So yeah, interesting group. Personally, one I'm a little confident is not going to be the greatest this year, but Jesse Minter can make gold out of poop. He's great at doing that. I don't have a lack of faith that he will make this group playable. I think for me, it's about, as I've said on previous podcasts, where are you getting the pass rush pressure from in this group? Taylor Tart, pretty good rusher. Outside of that, is Caldwell that impact pass rusher year one? I don't know, right? Like, is that what they expect from him? I think he certainly could, be a pretty decent pass rusher. To me, a better pass rusher than the stats indicated at Oregon last year. if you turn on the tape. But you got to make up that production from somewhere on this roster. And, what you got out of Poona Ford and Morgan Fox, particularly from a pass rush standpoint last year. So that, I think, is the big question about this room going forward into the 2025 campaign. Linebackers, Deion Henley, Junior Colson, Denzel Perriman, Troy Dye, Del'Shawn Phillips. They signed Phillips from Houston in the offseason to kind of be their Nick Neiman replacement, who ironically went to Houston. So they sort of did a linebacker swap, if you will, indirectly. But Phillips is going to be that all-around special teams guy. Dye will do some of that as well, in addition to playing sometimes. I do think this is the Colson leap year, if you will. Perriman's a little older, right? I do think they sort of want him to take a little bit more, be more that third linebacker than second or first this year. If you want to, I think they are very invested in seeing that progression, certainly from Junior Colson. Minter talked about all the stuff he went through last year as far as the injuries, as far as the appendectomy right before training camp and all that kind of stuff. And if you look at how the beat writers, have specifically talked about him, Popper and others, after OTAs last year, like it really felt like, okay, here comes Junior Colson at that time. And then I think, unfortunately, a lot of things did not go his way last year. But I still think there's a lot of institutional faith in him and Henley to kind of be the top linebacker duo with Perriman rotating in there, with Dye being involved as well. But I really do think this is the Junior Colson year, hopefully, if you will. The other two are Marlo Wax, linebacker from Syracuse, that they got an undrafted free agency, as well as Jeremiah Jean-Baptiste, who's been a practice squad mainstay. But I do think the five that they envision a clear role for here are pretty locked in. I do think Marlo Wax can be a pretty decent practice squad contender. Cornerbacks, 5. Cam Hart, Tarheeb Still, Dante Jackson, Benjamin St. Juste, and I did have Dean Leonard. Obviously, they drafted Triquez Bridges, who does not necessarily fit directly as a safety or corner. He did both pretty extensively at Florida, but based on what Minter has liked as far as body types, and I think, particularly the RJ Mickens pick as well, I do think they kind of envision Bridges more at corner than they do safety. And then after that, you have Ja'Sir Taylor, Miles Purchase, Nico Reed, Eric Rogers, and Jordan Oludokun. They spent 4 undrafted free agent picks on cornerbacks, so they certainly want some competition, some practice squad infighting and stuff like that to sort of bolster the room a little bit. So I find that pretty interesting. I think Bridges is the one who, if any of these guys who I currently have as off make the roster, it is probably him, maybe over like a Dean Leonard if they feel like they have too many outside corners between Jackson and St. Juste and Cam. If they want another slot nickel type, I do think that is more what Triquez would bring to the roster, as opposed to playing like some outside. But he's versatile. He can do a bunch of stuff. But right now, I sort of see him off the roster, but certainly can compete his way onto it. Draft pick status does matter, as far as like what is their vision for a guy. But clearly, if you look at their undrafted free agent pathway here and the sheer amount of guys they've signed, this is a spot where they feel like they can get some more of those Minter special teams contributors, both on the practice squad, Minter defensive contributors, as well as Ryan Ficken special teams contributors. Probably as guys that will be either contending for the practice squad or maybe contending for a 5th or even a 6th quarterback slot. But I do have 5 right now. If it was 6 and Bridges made it, I obviously would not be surprised by that at all. Safeties, Derwin James, Alohi Gilman, Elijah Molden, and RJ Mickens. I do think the 6th-round pick out of Clemson makes the roster as currently constructed. Others I do have Tony Jefferson and Jalen Jones was their undrafted free agent pick from here. Emily Johnson and Kendall Williamson are both guys from last year's team that were involved in the practice squad. Kendall Williamson actually did get some pretty decent burn with a lot of the safety injuries they had last year. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what they expect from him in terms of contributions. I really think this is about Tony versus RJ Mickens. And I think this is maybe a competition in the preseason, but I also really don't think they want to cut RJ Mickens. I think he's going to be very involved this year, both defensively as well as from a special team standpoint. And if you look at how they used Tony last year, right, I do think he is a guy that can kind of oscillate between the main roster and the practice squad in this second phase of his career now, post first retirement, right? I think they kind of envision him still being in that role. Now, maybe he makes the initial 53-man like he did last year, and then they feel comfortable moving him throughout the season. Very possible. But at the current juncture, I do think they value Mickens more so over him in this 4-man setup. Maybe they keep Jefferson as a fifth safety on the roster, but he's not somebody that you necessarily, I think, have to worry about being poached at this stage of his career. I think he's always going to be someone that can take on those quality snaps should one of Derwin, Alohi, or Elijah be injured, like he played a lot towards the end of last season. But I think if you're kind of weighing the calculus here of, do we feel worse if we let Mickens test the waiver wire versus Tony Jefferson? That I think is something the Chargers will have to consider as they're building out the safety room. So I ultimately did go with Mickens over Tony Jefferson, Unc Jefferson, as he's known. But obviously, someone who's still going to be very involved in this safety room with how many times they've elevated him and how many times they've used him, right, throughout the season. And then the specialists. I don't really think there's anything to report of here. It is Cam Dicker, J.K. Scott, and Josh Harris. A lot of speculation, I think, throughout last year, as well as just talk about, like, could they bring in a punter, maybe in rookie minicamp, maybe in, an undrafted free agent to potentially push JK spot, or even use a draft pick on it. I never really was keen that was going to be something that was going to happen necessarily. I thought it was certainly possible if they wanted to bring competition in. I actually do think they brought a kicker from USC who got a rookie minicamp invite, but obviously no threat to Cameron Dicker or anything along those lines. But I thought maybe they would bring in a competitor for JK Scott's spot here. But honestly, he grades out pretty highly in a lot of the PFF analytic metrics, and his hang time is something that they covet. So as much as I think fans maybe aren't as high on J.K. Scott as the coaching staff is, he plays the brand of ball they want and ultimately does what he's asked. So I think they keep this trio together for the time being. And nothing to really think about on special teams. Obviously has the complete trust of Ryan Ficken when it comes to J.K. Scott there. But that will do it for me today. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. And let me know what you think about these 53-man roster predictions. Is there a guy maybe that I didn't have making the roster that you think could? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, bolt up, and I will see you guys next time.